My name's Stephanie, I'm in my 30s, and I'm from Pasadena, California. I only mention that because, as a listener, I find it super annoying when people don't make it clear who they are at the start of their stories. In the spring of late 2017, I've been living with a girl named Lyra for 2 years, and she was easily one of the most chill roommates I'd ever had. We'd met through a friend of a friend when I first moved to Pasadena, and I was desperate for a place to stay. Lyra had a spare room and a rent that she couldn't cover alone, so we made it work. At 26, she was only a year older than me, but she had this sort of worldliness and maturity that made our cramped 2-bedroom apartment feel more like a home. She was an artist in her spare time, and she was a good one too. She was always drawing things in her little sketchbook, birds or vines or pretty spiraling shapes, and she was just as creative when it came to home decor. She wasn't a huge party animal either, which was nice because my job at a coffee shop involved waking up at 5:30 in the morning, and I'd keep the coffee pot warm for her in the morning before I headed to work. It was simple, comfortable, like we figured out some unspoken rhythm. Then one day, in April of 2017, she sat me down at her kitchen table and told me that she was going to Bolivia for 2 weeks. Her eyes had this spark about them as she mentioned something called an ayahuasca retreat, like she was already halfway there. I didn't know what ayahuasca was at the time. It sounded like some kind of yoga thing, so I just sort of smiled and said it sounded amazing. Then, around a week later, she packed her things and off she went. I wished her safe travels, waved from the window, and figured that she'd return with some epic stories and maybe a kooky souvenir or two. That night, I was alone in the apartment and I googled ayahuasca and learned it was a kind of hallucinogenic tea used in rituals down in places like Peru or Brazil. People drank it with shamans, puked their guts out, and then saw visions of gods or demons or whatever else lurked inside their minds. Users claimed it was supposed to crack you open or release your soul among dozens of other very grandiose statements. And that wasn't my kind of scene. I liked my reality unscrambled and my feet planted very solid on the ground. But for Lyra, it must have sounded like the adventure of a lifetime. She was the spiritual one, always chasing something deeper with stuff like medication, apps, tarot cards, or the cluster of quartz crystals that she kept on the windowsill. And I went to bed imagining her coming back with a tan and some crazy tale about talking to a jaguar spirit. I kept the apartment running for her 2-week absence, and then when she came back, I was ready to hear everything. Lyra texted me saying that she was about to catch a cab home from the airport, and then about an hour later, the door creaked open and she stepped inside with her bag slung over one shoulder. I'd expected her to return looking relaxed and refreshed with obviously a nice healthy tan, and instead, her hair was a tangled, unwashed mess, and her skin looked chalky, like the sun hadn't touched her for the whole 2 weeks. When I asked her if she had fun, she didn't even smile. Lyra dropped the bag by the door and then looked at me, except it didn't feel like she was looking at me, more like through me or past me. In this flat, distant voice, she simply said it was intense, and then she shuffled to her room and closed the door behind her. And that was the first sign that something was clearly off. Lyra had always been very sociable, the kind of person who'd flop down next to me and ramble on about her shift at the bookstore or the new sketch that she was working on. But after her trip to Bolivia, she seemed distant, and I told myself it was exhaustion or jet lag or something like that, but after another Google search I discovered that the retreat might have been rougher than expected, and I read about the purging, the vomiting, and the hours upon hours of feeling like your mind was unspooling, and then thought, geez, no wonder she's acting so shell-shocked. She probably just needed time to settle in, so I figured that I'd give her the space that she needed, but time didn't seem to fix anything. A week passed, but Lyra didn't snap back. She got super quiet, like she didn't answer me if I asked something, but only in short, clipped words, and she never started conversations anymore. Her sketches stopped showing up on the fridge, and the plants that I'd watered while she was gone started to wilt, but it was like she didn't even notice. I started to worry that she might have gotten some bad news or that her trip to Bolivia had gone wrong somehow. But when I asked, Lyra said that she didn't want to talk about it. I figured my suspicions were correct and that whatever it was, she'd talk about it when and if she was ready to. I also figured it'd be a matter of days at most before Lyra started to feel better. But I was wrong, and things only got weirder. For as long as I'd known her, Lyra had always been a vegetarian. She was a great cook. She'd make stir-fries with peppers and tofu or big salads with nuts sprinkled on top. I'd regularly find bowls of fruit on the counter, mostly apples or mangoes, and I loved living with someone who shared my passion for healthy eating. But then, just less than 2 weeks after Lyra got back from her ayahuasca retreat, the raw beef started appearing. And the first time I saw some, I had almost a gaslight moment where I thought, I don't remember buying ground beef. And then, when I realized that it was Lyra's, I think I actually kind of gasped out loud. I asked her why the sudden change of heart, and I never forgot how flat her tone of voice sounded as she shrugged her shoulders and said, "Time for a change, I guess." I cannot stress how unlike Lyra that was, and by that time, I was really starting to worry about her. But then I saw how she ate it. She didn't cook the ground beef she bought. She ate it raw, with her hands. She developed this habit of doing it late at night, too, like this one time when I woke up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. I was heading back to bed when I heard the creak of the fridge door coming from the apartment's kitchen and sitting area. It was almost 3 a.m., and when I peeked around the door, I saw the moon was kind of pouring through the blinds, turning the floor into this sort of grid of shadows. And there was Lyra, too, standing at the window, just staring up at the moon. I stood there watching her silently until she swayed slightly, and then I sort of bolted back to my room. And the next day, I once again asked if she was okay or if there was anything she wanted to talk about. But she told me what I'm now quite certain was a lie, and she said she was fine. I told myself that she even got so much as a tiny bit worse, I was probably going to try and get her family involved and organize some kind of intervention. And then the next thing I knew, the insects started appearing. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was in the kitchen making toast when I heard a crunch behind me and turned. Lyra was sitting at the table, a mason jar in front of her, and inside of it were live crickets. I watched in horror as she reached inside. The cricket's legs were scrabbling against the glass, and she plucked out one with her fingers and threw it into her mouth. I froze. There was a butter knife tight in my grip, with a wet, brittle sound making my stomach drop. I turned back to the counter and smeared the butter on my toast and then walked out like nothing had happened. But then, when it happened a second time, I couldn't ignore it. A few days later, it was beetles, these big, shiny black ones. I found her eating them, standing by the sink, and this time I gagged, the sound slipping out before I could stop it. She didn't react, she just kept eating, but when I demanded to know what had gotten into her, she swallowed what was in her mouth and started speaking. She told me that she learned a thing or two about herself down in Bolivia, and that she decided to make some changes. And if I didn't want to try out her new diet, that was fine, but I wasn't about to dictate what she could and could not eat in her own apartment. She didn't sound threatening or anything, but again, seeing Lyra act even remotely confrontational was so unlike her that it actually freaked me out. And before long, the apartment didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like hers, like she'd claimed it. And her room started to stink, a very thick, earthy smell, like wet dirt and rot. And she stopped showering. Her hair was clumping into these greasy knots, and her clothes kind of hung off of her as she started to lose weight, too. I wanted to ask what happened down there, what she'd seen in that jungle, but every time I tried, something stopped me. And I started locking my bedroom door. It was a very flimsy door, the kind that you could probably pop open with a credit card, but it made me feel just that little bit safer. I'd lie there, my phone under my pillow, listening to Lyra pacing around outside. Work became my lifeline. 8 hours at the coffee shop, steaming milk, wiping counters, and chatting with regulars who didn't know that my roommate was unraveling back home. Then, come the end of the day, I'd linger after my shift, nursing a cold latte and delaying the walk home, but I had to go back eventually. And when I did, there she'd be, sitting or standing by the window, and either waiting for or staring at the moon. The next thing I remember is how she started covering up all the mirrors one day. I came home to find every single one in the apartment draped with towels or turned to face the wall, and that was also the day that I found scratches on the bathroom door, these deep gouges like she'd been clawing at it with something. She vandalized her own sketchbooks too, the ones that she used to fill with all of her pretty drawings. Pages had been torn out or crumpled up, and the ones that remained were covered in these strange charcoal scribbles that creeped me out just to look at them. And that was the point that I realized that she needed help. Very urgent help too, and the next day, once I got home from work, I was going to try and talk to her about getting some. If that didn't work, it was then time for Plan B, the intervention. But the horrible irony of all of this is that by the time I actually decided to act, it was already too late. The next evening, it was dark when I arrived home from work. Then, when I unlocked the door, I walked into the apartment, and the first thing that hit me was the smell. It was sort of this wet and coppery smell, heavier than the beef had ever been. The apartment was dark, so I figured no one was home, but when I flipped the light switch, there was Lyra, sitting in the middle of the TV room, or at least what was left of her. She was sitting cross-legged, our big kitchen knife in one hand, a flap of her own skin in the other. She'd peeled it back from her face, starting at her forehead, and had pulled it down, like a mask. She looked at me, the raw flesh of her forehead glistening as blood dripped onto her thighs. And then, with lips that were streaked with red, she told me, "I need to see who's underneath." I dropped my bag and ran, screaming as I went. I made it to my room, slammed the door, and then pressed my back against it after locking it. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone. Then I dialed 911 and told the dispatcher what was happening. And as I spoke, I could hear her out there in the hallway. That knife sounded like it was scraping against something, and she was muttering louder and louder, and then it stopped, replaced by a low, keening sound, like she'd finally realized what she was doing, or had only now just started to feel the pain of what she'd done to her face. I slid down on the floor, my knees pulled up with my finger in one ear and the dispatcher in the other, and just waited. I was shaking, but thankfully the cops got there fast. I heard the front door burst open as a boot hit the frame, and then after the distinct sound of the two cops shouting some commands, I heard this feral, inhuman snarl before the slap, slap, slap of bare feet on hardwood floor. There was another shout, a command to stop, and then 2 shots, sharp and loud. The shots were terrifying, but the silence that hung in the air afterwards was somehow even worse. By the time I unlocked the door, 2 EMTs were zipping Lyra up into a bag. Her face, or what was left of it, was turned toward me with one eye still open, cloudy and still. One of the cops asked if I was okay. I nodded in the moment, but I wasn't. I was more shaken up than I'd ever been in my whole life. I didn't stay. I couldn't. I grabbed my keys and my phone and drove to my friend Mia's place across town. She opened the door in pajamas and took one look at me and pulled me inside. I crashed on her couch and then told her everything in bits and pieces. My friend didn't say much. She just gave me a hug and handed me a blanket and let me sleep after assuring me that everything would be fine. A few days later, once the cops finished with the scene, we went back to the apartment. Me, Mia, and her boyfriend in the latter's truck. And we packed all of my stuff up in under an hour, and the landlord didn't fight me when I broke the lease. He'd already seen the bloodstains on the hardwood. I live with Mia now. Her spare room is small, just a twin bed and a dresser, but it's mine. And sleep was very tough for a while. I'd have nightmares about Lyra, crickets and beetles crawling out of her open mouth before her whole face split open, and I'd wake up sweating, and then lie there till the sun came up, wondering what she saw in that jungle and what she brought back with her. The cops called it a psychotic break and blamed the ayahuasca. I read for myself that it happens sometimes, and I guess it does make sense. But there are times at night that I still keep the lights on, and I still lock my bedroom door, and I still check the mirror before I sleep just to make sure that it's still me looking back.